Yeah, and I wanted to say something earlier. Um, I know a lot of you are surprised by how we defend and talk about Cody and Robin, and we're not doing this to bash them down. But Mykelti tells me stories when they were like dirt poor back in the day, and she would have like hot dogs for dinner.
Hot dogs? Are you kidding? We'd be lucky if we get hot dogs. We'd get
We'd be lucky
bread.
if we had hot
like
dogs.
3-day-old bread.
Hey everyone, it's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. Welcome back to my channel. It's Thursday, January 19th, 2023. Do you remember on the Sister Wives Tell-All when Kody Brown said, "Nothing scares me but poverty"? And he was like really agitated. Remember that?
And I was like, I don't want to be a quitter. And she's going, well, you're a coward. Well, no, 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 no. I'm not a coward. Nothing scares me but poverty. Nothing.
And he also said, like, it's all ego, baby. Remember that? And everyone was like, well, you're about to know what it feels like because all of your wives are leaving and the money train is drying up and your show could be off the air, right? And I was thinking about how the sister wives have been like running around from debt to debt to debt to debt to debt for years, and they had filed bankruptcies and there was welfare stuff and all kinds of things that happened before the show. But I had never really understood the severity of what they lived in before they got famous. And it wasn't until, because they don't talk about it. They talk about how their resources were finite, how they had to stretch the budget, how bills had to be stretched out, how feeding the kids was expensive. There was a lot we learned in that first season where we saw that while they had a home and they had all of these things, they were still struggling financially. And that was a huge, huge concern for Janelle. Well, I guess the concerns are not without validity because apparently Mykelti was sharing during her live stream last night that the Browns weren't even able to feed their kids when they lived in Wyoming. And that they didn't even have the money to go grocery shopping or buy food. And instead, they ate day-old bread, 3-day-old bread, or bread that was expired that came from his parents' bakery and on moldy food. So his fears of poverty are because he raised his kids in poverty. And I've never heard these stories. They've never even talked about where they've come from. They don't talk about that they had multiple bankruptcies on the show. They don't talk about the welfare that they needed and the food stamps that they used. They don't talk about any of that. In Wyoming, apparently, they had nothing. And I'll just state this, that when they left Wyoming, he got a better job in Utah, but they ended up foreclosing on their home. And they declared bankruptcy in 2005 before they moved. So before they left and they moved to Lehigh, the kids were living in very dire conditions. And this is straight from the mouth of Mykelti Padron, who is Christine and Kody's second oldest daughter. So, wow. Let's dive into Kody's poverty. Before we dive into today's topic, can you do me a big favor and give this video a thumbs up? Also, subscribe to my channel if you have not yet subscribed by clicking the bell down there, and turn those notifications on so you know when I go live or when new content loads. And as always, share this video with your friends. So I just want to start off right off the bat by saying that anyone that grows up with not a lot of money knows a lot of things like the soup, drinking soup that's the leftovers from hot dogs. That was something I never knew about until I married my husband, because my husband grew up with not a lot of money and his dad didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have money to feed them. And so they had to like spread out, and there was a lot of kids to feed. And so when I heard Mykelti talking, it actually took me back to my husband's upbringing and how he grew up living on what they would call wiener water soup. You know how it's that saltiness that's on hot dogs, they would eat they would drink the water after they made the hot dogs, and that would be dinner. So it sounds like the Browns actually had a similar way of living. And this way of living was very different than the way the younger kids have lived. The younger kids have lived a life of more affluence. You know, Janelle has more money, Christine has more money. They have been living in larger homes. The show got them into their biggest houses they've ever had. They have a $1.2 million house, Kody does, with Robin in Flagstaff. They owned 4,000 and 5,000 square foot homes when they moved to Vegas. That is not what they were used to and not what they had at all. And you know what's ironic in all of this is while they were not able to pay for their food for kids, Kody had a Lexus that he was driving. Interesting, right? But let's dive into what they revealed about eating and the poverty they lived in.
Yes, Lisa. I'm sure the experiences were super different. But Mykelti tells me stories when they were like dirt poor back in the day, and she would have like hot dogs for dinner.
Hot dogs? Are you kidding? We'd be lucky if we get hot dogs. We'd get
Lucky
bread.
we had hot
like
dogs.
3-day-old bread.
So
My family.
sad.
So back in Wyoming, my family, my dad's dad owned a ranch, and on the ranch there was a bakery. And one of the things that we actually ate a lot was because my parents couldn't afford anything else, was the discards from the bakery. It was the day olds. It was the stuff they couldn't sell.
So when they live in Wyoming, they live on his dad's ranch, right? The ranch that they went up to Wyoming to go get the cattle. You remember they did that whole episode where they took the cattle and they had to like bring them back for their vaccinations. Remember that? So they go to that ranch, and that was the same place that Mykelti got hurt. Remember that? She fell off a horse. That ranch they lived on, right? And they didn't have any money for food. So they lived on the bakery leftovers, day olds. So bakeries that have sweets like donuts and pastries and bread. So their kids lived on nutritionally poor, nothing of substance. I mean, imagine your kids living on white bread or donuts, and that's the only thing that you can feed your kids. And it's really not ironic, or it's not funny, haha. It's just funny that now that Kody has this show and he's so obsessed with staying on the show because of the money that he makes, that he's gone to levels to try to silence his children, doesn't want to go back to poverty that he lived in before, that they've never talked about. Do you remember ever hearing a story from them saying, I didn't have money to feed our kids, we couldn't afford food, our kids lived off day-old bread, 3-day-old bread, donuts, pastries? I think people would have been like outraged, right? To know that they've been trying to sell you this like glorious thing about polygamy and completely eliminating the aspect of poverty from their story. Because one of the biggest criticisms of polygamy is the fact that children live in poverty because there's not enough money to pay for all of the children that they have. And they had a bunch of kids right in a row while they were in Wyoming. So they can't afford to feed their kids, but they kept having children. They can't afford to feed their kids, but they bring in another wife. They can't afford to feed their kids, so they just, they all file for bankruptcy and they run from Wyoming to Utah. It's, when you put it into this perspective, it makes a lot of sense why he's so greedy and he's so controlling about this show, to control his family, to make it so his show stays on air, because he doesn't want to go back to that. But it's horrible that he's gotten so greedy that he's allowed himself to put the money above his children and his family, which the COVID rules, they're for the show, but really it's the show is more important to Kody than the family. The money is more important to Kody than the family. It's sad.
So, that was a lot of what we actually grew up on, was that, and MREs, funny enough. We had MREs because they're cheap. MREs are cheap.
And they last forever.
And they last forever. So my dad had a huge stockpile of MREs from whatever when he was, I don't know. So yeah. So my and my older siblings' relationship and experience with my dad and my mom's is vastly different than my younger siblings' relationship and experience, because my younger siblings, how they've been raised is my parents do have money, not necessarily craziness, but they have money that they could go get fresh groceries kind of thing. So the experience that they have is different.
Okay, this is weird because she says that they lived on day old bread or like expired bread and MREs, and says because MREs are cheap, and her dad had a bunch of MREs. I just Googled if MREs are cheap, and it actually says no, they're not cheap. They're actually expensive, but they last for a very long time. So was he spending his money on MREs, or did he get MREs as a trade? Because she said he got them from I don't know where. You know, a lot of these cults, the AUB and such, are survivalists, doomsday preppers. And so they have like their storage, you know, food bins, remember when he was like, well, do you want your food storage? Because they save food for when the world goes to an end. And Christine said, no, she didn't want the food storage. So did he buy a bunch of MRE for the food storage? Did they spend their money in food storage and then they didn't have money to feed the kids with fresh groceries? MREs are primarily used in the military and for survival. And when you're like in combat or you are away from a place where you can get fresh food, they're good in a pinch, but they're not necessarily something that you want to be living off of long term. And the fact that she says it's cheap is odd, because when I Google it, it says they're expensive. I'm sure there's places where you can get them wholesale or you can find them less expensive. But so instead of giving his kids fresh food, they live on MRE. And so on top of that, she says, my life is very different and my experience with my dad is different because we didn't have money for fresh groceries. Do you think he was do you think he spent his money on things that he shouldn't have been spending his money on? Or do you think he just didn't have the money to spend? It's like knowing what Kody spends, you know, knowing that Kody would have a luxury car, but he can't feed his kids is like shocking, right? Like, here, drive my Lexus, but eat an MRE.
Right. I do think that I will say this, and I don't care what magazine it ends up on. I think that my dad was a better father when I was younger. I think that when his kids multiplied like crazy, he started to get harder because it was harder to have relationships with all of them. So I think he was a better father when I was younger. I'll say that. I don't care where it ends up on.
Okay, this part is actually interesting because she said, my dad was a better dad when I was younger because he just kept having kids and the kids kept multiplying and he didn't have the time or the resources to spend being a father and being there for his kids and connecting to them. And I'm looking through the ages of the kids and they came so fast. There was Logan, who was first. Then you get Aspen. Like, there's a bunch of kids that are all born within a span of a couple years. There's Logan and Maddie and Hunter. They're all in Garrison. They're all within 4 years of each other. There's Aspen, Mykelti, and Peyton that are all within 3 years of each other. And then Leon was born. So Janelle had 4 kids within 4 years, and Christine had 3 kids within 4 years. And they're all like in the same time. So 7 kids. Mykelti is literally after Aspen, and there are several other children before her. So she's the 4th kid. So she's the 4th, and then after 4th, it's like bam, 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 bam. And then they're at like 12 kids. They had kids literally so fast. And he didn't have the money and the resources to do this. Like, he was so busy procreating and getting his wives pregnant, and they couldn't even feed their kids. And because of that, he didn't have the time or the energy or the resources to pay for them. They live in poverty on day-old bread. And now he's wealthier. They're living on better times because of the show. They aren't super wealthy because Kody is not good with his money. So even though he has wealth now because of the show, and he has property, everything has mortgages, and he doesn't always spend correctly and spend wisely. He doesn't make good financial decisions, and he doesn't invest, and therefore he doesn't have the same, like Jim Bob Duggar, for instance. He invested everything and he bought property and he didn't keep moving, and they kept moving and moving and moving and spending and spending and spending and spending higher than what they needed. And Janelle made the point this season that Kody was spending, they were spending from the family bank account frivolously. So Kody has gotten used to a level of wealth now, and he's probably desperate to not go back to the way he was before the show, because before the show he was in poverty. But it's sad to me that these kids were living in such dire conditions in Wyoming that they couldn't even eat food. But they never talk about that on the show. So I guess Mykelti said she doesn't care if it gets out there. So I'm putting this out there. Kody Brown's poverty and inability to feed his children exposed by Mykelti, and he was a better dad before he had too many kids to care. Tell me what your thoughts are in the comments below. Bye, guys.